April 28, 1945, 14:20 hours. Outskirts of Magdeburg, Western Germany. Private First Class Daniel Hoffman aimed his M1 Garand at the figure moving through the rubble ahead. His finger rested on the trigger, ready to fire at what should have been another Wehrmacht soldier. Then the figure stood up with hands raised, and Hoffman's breath caught in his throat. The soldier couldn't have been more than 14 years old. The Volkssturm uniform hung from his skeletal frame like a costume on a scarecrow. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, and the rifle he'd dropped at his feet was nearly as tall as he was. When the boy spoke, his voice cracked with puberty and terror. "Please don't shoot." Hoffman lowered his weapon slowly, feeling his hands shake for the first time since Normandy. Behind him, Sergeant Robert Mitchell moved up and stopped short, staring at the child in the uniform. "Jesus Christ," Mitchell whispered. "He's younger than my son." For thousands of German boys conscripted into Hitler's desperate final defense, capture meant the end of one nightmare and the beginning of something they'd never been taught to expect. Not execution, not torture, but mercy from the men they'd been trained to kill. And for a handful of American soldiers who couldn't forget the faces of children in uniforms, victory would mean something more than conquest. It would mean becoming fathers to enemy orphans who had nowhere left to go. The desperate harvest. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was consuming its own children to fuel a war already lost. The Volkssturm had evolved from a last-resort militia into a systematic harvesting of youth. Boys pulled from schools, from bombed-out homes, from any place they could be found, and given weapons they barely knew how to fire. The numbers told a story of institutional desperation. Boys aged 12 to 16 conscripted into combat roles. 1944-45, approximately 100,000. Average training period, 3 to 7 days. Orphaned by war's end, estimated 40,000, 60,000. Casualties among child soldiers, 25,000 and 30,000 killed in action. Survivors captured by American forces, approximately 15,000 and 20,000. The children drafted into this final sacrifice had grown up knowing nothing but Nazi indoctrination. Many had been in Hitler Youth since age 6, taught that dying for the Führer was the highest honor, that Americans were subhuman monsters, that surrender meant torture worse than death. When they found themselves in American custody, their entire worldview faced immediate collapse. 14-year-old Werner Schmidt had fired a Panzerfaust at an American tank near Leipzig. The weapon's backblast knocked him unconscious, and he woke in an American aid station with a medic bandaging his burns. "I thought I was in hell," he recalled decades later. "I'd been taught Americans skinned prisoners alive. Instead, the first thing that happened was a soldier gave me morphine for the pain and called me son." The first encounters. American forces advancing through Germany in spring 1945 were psychologically unprepared for the systematic deployment of children as combatants. Combat veterans who'd fought across Europe suddenly confronted enemies who looked like they belonged in middle school classrooms, not battlefields. Staff Sergeant James Walsh of the 3rd Armored Division described his unit's first encounter with Volkssturm child soldiers near Paderborn. "We took fire from a building and returned it. When we cleared the position, we found 6 kids inside. 2 were dead. The others were maybe 13, 14 years old, crying and begging not to be killed. One of my men, a father of 3, just sat down on the floor and started sobbing. We'd killed children because they were shooting at us, and there was no way to make that feel right." The moral paradox was immediate and searing. These children posed genuine tactical threats. They fired real weapons, called in real artillery, set real ambushes, but killing them violated every instinct about protected childhood and civilized warfare. American soldiers found themselves caught between military necessity and moral revulsion. The solution emerged organically at the small unit level: aggressive efforts to capture rather than kill. When encountering obvious child soldiers, American forces would call for surrender in German, use loudspeakers, hold fire longer than tactically prudent, deliberately aim to wound rather than kill. These weren't official policies. They were individual moral choices made by soldiers who couldn't live with the alternative. Captain Edward Morrison of the 89th Infantry Division issued informal guidance to his company. If they look young enough to be your kid brother, try everything before you shoot. I'm not asking you to die for mercy, but I'm asking you to risk something to avoid killing children if there's any other way. The Camps of Transformation. When the fighting ended in May 1945, American forces found themselves managing thousands of captured child soldiers whose status defied normal prisoner-of-war categories. They were technically enemy combatants, but they were also obviously children, many orphaned, all traumatized, none guilty of crimes beyond following orders issued by adults who'd betrayed them. The holding camps established for young prisoners quickly evolved into something between POW facilities and humanitarian shelters. American personnel made informal accommodations that reflected their discomfort with treating children as enemy prisoners. At Camp Sheridan near Frankfurt, Army Chaplain Captain William Hayes organized the processing of 347 captured Volkssturm members aged 12 to 17. His initial report to division headquarters captured the moral complexity. These are not soldiers in any meaningful sense. They are children who were armed and abandoned. Recommend immediate reclassification for humanitarian processing rather than standard POW protocols. The recommendations were implemented through improvisation rather than official policy. Extra rations appeared for young prisoners. Medical care was prioritized. Educational programs emerged spontaneously as soldiers with teaching backgrounds organized classes. Recreation areas appeared, makeshift soccer fields, basketball courts, areas for games that let children be children again. The psychological transformation was often dramatic. Boys who'd expected execution discovered Americans playing catch with them, teaching them English phrases, sharing photographs of their own children back home. The cognitive dissonance challenged everything they'd been taught about enemy barbarism. The hardest part was accepting that everything had been lies, recalled Franz Becker, captured at age 15 near Nuremberg. Americans were supposed to be monsters. Instead, they gave me chocolate and taught me how to throw a curveball. A sergeant from Iowa spent hours with me, showing me pictures of his farm. He had a son my age. The kindness was harder to process than combat had been. The orphan crisis. As American occupation authorities conducted censuses and attempted to reunify families, the scale of child abandonment became horrifyingly clear. The Hitler Youth and Volkssturm had conscripted boys from across Germany, often separating them from families already fractured by bombing, evacuation, and casualties. Many had no homes to return to, parents dead, cities destroyed, family networks obliterated. The numbers documented a generation of abandoned children. German war orphans by war's end, approximately 500,000. Former child soldiers with no living relatives, estimated 8,000, 12,000. In American occupation zones, approximately 150,000 orphans requiring care. Former Volkssturm members in orphan facilities, 5,000, 7,000. American military government faced an administrative and moral challenge with no precedent. These children needed food, shelter, medical care, education, and psychological support. Many remained in uniform fragments because they owned no other clothing. Some refused to give their real names, ashamed of having fought for a regime now universally condemned. The U.S. military responded with resources that exceeded minimum humanitarian obligations. Orphan facilities were established in requisitioned buildings. Former Nazi administrative centers, seized estates, repurposed military barracks. American personnel staffed them with a combination of occupation soldiers, displaced persons relief workers, and German civilians deemed politically acceptable. Captain Sarah Chen of the Army Nurse Corps supervised medical care for 180 orphaned boys at a facility near Munich. Her letters home described the challenge. They're physically malnourished and emotionally shattered. Many have nightmares. Some still flinch when we approach, expecting violence. They've been taught that kindness is weakness, and that trust leads to betrayal. Teaching them they're safe takes weeks of patience. The unexpected bonds. Within the orphan facilities and holding camps, relationships formed that transcended the formal structure of occupation and custody. American soldiers who visited these facilities, initially out of duty, curiosity, or boredom, found themselves forming attachments to children who reminded them of sons, brothers, or their younger selves. Private Eugene Henderson from Texas started visiting an orphan center near Heidelberg because he'd been assigned guard duty there. He met 12-year-old Matthias Schultz, who'd been conscripted from a destroyed Berlin neighborhood and had watched his parents die in a bombing raid. The boy barely spoke, moved like a ghost through the facility, refused to engage with other children. Henderson began bringing Matthias small gifts, candy bars, comic books, a baseball and glove. He spent hours teaching the boy to play catch, using gestures when language failed. Slowly, tentatively, Matthias began to respond. After 2 months, he spoke his first English phrase. "Thank you." That's when I knew I couldn't leave him, Henderson wrote to his wife in September 1945. He's got nobody. His whole family is gone. His country destroyed him and threw him away. I keep thinking about our boys at home, safe and loved, and I can't walk away from this kid who never had that chance. Similar bonds formed across occupation zones. Sergeant Frank Kowalski, a Chicago factory worker before the war, became a de facto father figure to 3 orphaned brothers aged 11, 13, and 15, who'd all been conscripted into the Volkssturm. Lieutenant Robert Yamamoto, a Nisei officer whose own family had been interned in America, spent his off-duty hours teaching English to groups of former child soldiers at a facility near Würzburg. The relationships challenged both the Americans' understanding of enemy identity and the German children's indoctrination about American character. Soldiers who'd fought Wehrmacht, professionals, found themselves reading bedtime stories to former enemy combatants. Children who'd been taught Americans were demons discovered men who showed them the first genuine affection many had experienced in years: the adoption movement. By late 1945, informal requests from soldiers seeking to adopt German orphans had created administrative confusion for military and State Department personnel. There was no established process for American servicemen to adopt children from enemy nations, no legal framework for bringing former enemy soldiers, even child soldiers, to America. The first documented case involved Staff Sergeant Thomas Riley, who formally requested permission to adopt 16-year-old Klaus Dietrich in November 1945. Riley's petition to his commanding officer was straightforward. "This boy has no family, no home, and no future in Germany. I have the means to provide for him, the desire to raise him, and his consent. Request guidance on legal procedures." The request triggered bureaucratic chaos. Military legal offices consulted with State Department officials, who consulted with immigration authorities, who discovered the existing legal framework was entirely inadequate for the situation. Could former enemy combatants immigrate? Could American servicemen adopt foreign nationals while on occupation duty? What status would these children have? The Army's solution was characteristically pragmatic. Work with the American Red Cross and civilian adoption agencies to create procedures on the fly. By early 1946, a process emerged that allowed servicemen with verified income, suitable home conditions, and command approval to petition for adoption of German orphans. The process required extensive documentation, home studies conducted through international agencies, and ultimate approval from military government authorities. The numbers remained small, but significant. Formal adoption petitions filed by American servicemen, 1945-47, approximately 180. Approved and completed, 127. Orphans brought to America, 134, including some group adoptions. Former child soldiers among adoptees, approximately 40. Each case required months of processing. Background investigations verified the orphan's status, confirmed no living relatives existed or could be located, and assessed the prospective adoptive parents' suitability. American servicemen had to prove they could financially support a child, provide stable housing, and integrate a German-speaking war orphan into American society. The journey across. In March 1947, the first group of 8 adopted German orphans accompanied their new American fathers on a military transport from Bremerhaven to New York. The boys ranged from age 11 to 17. 3 were former Volkssturm members. All were making a journey they could never have imagined 2 years earlier when they'd been wearing enemy uniforms. The scene at the port was documented by Army photographers and reporters who recognized the human interest story. Former enemy soldiers boarding American ships, not as prisoners, but as sons. German boys who'd fired at Americans now traveling under American protection to American homes. 15-year-old Werner Schmidt stood on deck beside his adoptive father, Sergeant James Walsh, watching the German coastline disappear. "I kept thinking it wasn't real," he recalled decades later. 2 years ago, I'd tried to kill Americans. Now I was going to live in America with one of them. My entire understanding of the world had been lies, and the truth was so strange, I couldn't process it. The arrivals in America created local news stories that captured public attention. Communities rallied around the adopted orphans, providing clothing, school supplies, and welcoming support. Churches organized collections. Neighbors donated furniture for rooms being prepared. American families who'd sent sons to fight Germans now welcomed German children into their communities. The adoptive parents faced challenges integrating traumatized war orphans into American life. Language barriers required patience and creativity. Nightmares persisted for years. Some boys struggled with guilt about their past, others with adjustment to a society that seemed impossibly abundant after years of scarcity and destruction. But the overwhelming pattern was successful integration. The adopted orphans learned English, attended American schools, participated in communities that embraced them as proof that even the bitterest enemies could find reconciliation. They became living evidence that mercy could transcend nationality, that children were children regardless of the uniforms they'd worn. The psychological reckoning. For both the adopted children and their new fathers, the relationships required processing profound psychological complexity. American veterans who'd lost friends to German fire now raised German children in their homes. German boys who'd been taught to kill Americans now called Americans Dad and pledged allegiance to the American flag. The psychological work was ongoing and often difficult. Therapists who treated both the adoptive families and the orphans documented the challenges of building trust across national and linguistic divides, of processing wartime trauma within new family structures, of reconciling past and present identities. Dr. Margaret Hayes, a psychologist who worked with adopted German orphans in New York, described the therapeutic challenge. These boys carry multiple layers of trauma: combat exposure, loss of family, destruction of homeland, collapse of ideology they'd been taught to believe absolutely. Then they're transplanted to a foreign country with foreign customs, expected to integrate and thrive. The resilience they show is extraordinary. The adoptive fathers carried their own burdens. Many struggled with community judgment, neighbors who questioned why they'd bring enemy children to America when American veterans needed support. Some faced criticism from fellow veterans who saw adoption of German orphans as betraying comrades who'd died fighting Germans. Private Eugene Henderson faced hostile questions at his American Legion post in Texas. His response became frequently quoted: "I didn't betray anybody. I fought Germans who deserved it." Matthias was 12 years old and had no choice about being in uniform. Adopting him doesn't dishonor the men we lost. It honors what we were fighting for: a world where children don't get sacrificed by evil governments. The letters that traveled back. As the adopted orphans integrated into American life, many maintained correspondence with friends remaining in Germany. Other orphans in institutions, former comrades from Volkssturm units, the few relatives who survived. Their letters documented transformation from enemy soldiers to American sons, creating testimonies that influenced German understanding of American character. Klaus Dietrich, adopted by Staff Sergeant Thomas Riley, wrote to a friend in a German orphanage in 1948, "You wouldn't believe America. My father, I call him Dad now, works in a factory, and we have a house with 3 bedrooms. I go to high school and play on the baseball team. People know I'm German and was in the Volkssturm, but they treat me like any other kid. The propaganda we were taught was completely backwards. Americans aren't monsters. They're the most generous people I've ever known." These letters circulated in German orphan facilities and youth groups, providing perspectives that challenged lingering Nazi indoctrination and influenced emerging West German attitudes toward America. The testimony of former child soldiers who'd found homes with former enemies carried authority that official denazification programs couldn't match. The correspondence also documented ongoing challenges. Some adopted orphans struggled with identity questions. Were they German or American? Could they be both? Others faced discrimination despite adoptive family support. A few experienced rejection from German relatives who viewed their adoption as betrayal of national identity. But the dominant pattern was successful integration and lasting gratitude. The adopted orphans overwhelmingly described their American families as having saved their lives in ways that transcended physical rescue, providing emotional healing and future possibility that would have been impossible in destroyed Germany. The closing testament. On May 8, 1995, the 50th anniversary of VE Day, 73-year-old Werner Schmidt stood at the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., beside his adoptive father, James Walsh, now 91 years old. Schmidt held a photograph from 1945 showing himself at 15, skeletal, haunted, wearing a torn Volkssturm uniform, standing next to a young American sergeant who'd just captured him. "He could have killed me," Schmidt told a reporter. "I'd shot at his friends. I was armed and hostile. Instead, he gave me water and called me son." Eventually, he made it official. "I've lived an entire life I should never have had. Married an American woman, raised 3 children, taught history at a university. All because this man saw a child instead of an enemy." Walsh, leaning heavily on a cane, placed his hand on Schmidt's shoulder. "He was just a kid," the old veteran said quietly. "They'd put him in a uniform and given him a rifle, but he was just a kid. I had children at home. I couldn't walk away from another child who had nobody. The story of German orphan child soldiers adopted by American servicemen never became well-known history. No major films dramatized it. Few history books devoted more than footnotes to the phenomenon. But for the 134 orphans who crossed the Atlantic to become American sons, and for the servicemen who chose fatherhood over hatred, the story represented something fundamental about the possibility of redemption after even the most terrible conflicts. They proved that mercy could transcend the bitterness of war, that children were children regardless of the uniforms they'd worn, and that some victories are measured not in territory conquered, but in lives reclaimed from the ruins of ideology and violence. The soldiers who defeated Nazi Germany gave a final gift to some of its youngest victims: a future worth living, a home built on compassion rather than hatred, and the chance to become something more than what war had tried to make them. In quiet American towns, men with German accents tell their grandchildren about the day they tried to kill Americans, and instead found fathers who taught them what mercy meant. And in the space between those two moments, between the child soldier surrendering in ruins and the old man standing at a memorial beside the veteran who became his father, lies proof that even after the worst humanity can inflict, redemption remains possible for those willing to choose it.